The moment King Solomon died, 5 terrible things happened immediately. Not years later, not gradually, immediately. A kingdom that looked untouchable began to split at the seams. The throne trembled. The people turned restless. Ancient judgments spoken in whispers during Solomon's lifetime suddenly moved like fire through dry wood. And what died that day was not only a king. Something invisible died with him, restraint covering the fragile barrier holding disaster back. This is the part history often rushes past. Solomon was the wisest king in Israel's story, the builder of the temple, the man drenched in glory, gold, and divine favor. So how could his death trigger chaos so fast? What had he already set in motion before his final breath? What unseen corruption was waiting for the funeral to end? Because Solomon did not merely leave behind a throne, he left behind a fracture. And to understand the collapse, we must first uncover the hidden rot inside his reign. Solomon did not collapse in a moment. He declined with precision. At the height of his power, when silver was counted as nothing in Jerusalem and the nations lined up to hear his words, something subtle began to shift beneath the surface. Not in public, not in ways that would alarm the crowds, but in choices small, calculated, almost invisible. There were ancient warnings written long before he took the throne. Laws not about survival, but about restraint. A king of Israel was told, do not multiply gold, do not multiply horses, do not multiply wives. Not because these things were evil in themselves, but because they had the power to slowly bend the heart away from God. Solomon broke all 3. Not by accident, not in ignorance, but with full awareness. Gold filled his treasuries beyond measure. Horses were imported from Egypt, symbols of military confidence and political entanglement. And his marriages, they became alliances, treaties sealed not just in diplomacy, but in intimacy. 700 wives, 300 concubines. But the number is not the real shock. What they carried into Israel is. Each woman came with a story, a homeland, a set of gods whispered in childhood and honored in secret rituals. They brought with them altars that did not belong to Jerusalem, names that did not belong to the covenant. And Solomon slowly, deliberately made space for them. At first it may have seemed harmless, a gesture of tolerance, a political necessity, a king maintaining peace across cultures. But spiritual compromise rarely announces itself as danger. It presents itself as wisdom. And that is where the drift becomes almost impossible to detect. Because Solomon was still wise, he still spoke proverbs, still judged disputes, still wrote about truth, about righteousness, about the fear of the Lord. Outwardly, nothing seemed broken, which raises a disturbing possibility. What if he did not lose wisdom, but chose to silence it? Because knowledge does not control desire, and truth, when ignored long enough, becomes background noise. Then came the shift that history rarely slows down to examine. The man who built the temple, the dwelling place of the God of Israel, began building something else. On the hills surrounding Jerusalem, altars appeared, not hidden, not buried, visible, intentional. Molech, a name associated with fire and sacrifice. Chemosh, a god of conquest and national pride. Ashtoreth, a symbol of fertility, desire, and power. These were not foreign lands. This was Israel, and this was Solomon. The same king who once prayed for wisdom now oversaw spaces where other gods were honored, not as rebellion but as accommodation, not as rejection but as inclusion. And that is what makes this moment so dangerous. Because it did not feel like collapse, it felt like expansion, more alliances, more influence, more cultural reach. But beneath it all, something sacred was being diluted. The covenant was no longer exclusive. The center was no longer stable. And the most unsettling part, God did not immediately stop him. No sudden judgment, no visible collapse. The kingdom continued to thrive. The temple still stood. The people still functioned. Life went on as if nothing had changed, which creates a tension that is easy to miss. Sometimes the absence of immediate consequences is not approval, it is delay. And delay can be more dangerous than punishment, because it allows a man to believe he is still standing, while everything inside him is already shifting. So the question is no longer whether Solomon was wise. The question is far more unsettling. How does a man who understands truth at the highest level become the one who quietly dismantles it? Because by the time Solomon reached the end of his life, the damage was not visible in ruins or war. It was embedded in systems, in altars, in loyalties, waiting. And the moment he died, those hidden fractures would no longer stay hidden. We uncover the moment a prophecy was spoken, not as a warning, but as a countdown, and why the kingdom was already divided long before anyone realized it. Most people hear the word prophecy and imagine a warning, a final chance, a door still open. But this prophecy was different. It did not come like a plea. It came like a sentence already written, waiting for its hour. By the time Solomon's private compromises had hardened into public altars, the crisis was no longer approaching. In the eyes of heaven, it had already begun. The kingdom still looked whole. The palace still functioned. The temple still crowned Jerusalem with sacred beauty. But beneath the gold, beneath the ceremonies, beneath the illusion of permanence, a clock had started ticking. And into that silence stepped a prophet. His name was Ahijah, not a general, not a court official, not a man with armies or influence, just a prophet carrying a message no throne could silence. And the way the message came was almost unnervingly physical. A new garment, a cloak still whole in his hands. Then suddenly, it was torn into 12 pieces. 12. The number of tribes, the number of covenant order, the number of Israel as one people before God. 10 pieces were handed to Jeroboam, not after Solomon died, not after civil war, not after national collapse, before. That is the part many people miss. The kingdom was symbolically split while Solomon was still breathing. The fracture came first in the unseen realm of divine judgment and only later in visible history. In other words, the collapse did not begin when the nation broke apart. It began when God declared that it would. And God did not say, "It may happen." He did not say, "If things continue like this." He said, in essence, "It will happen." For David's sake, for the sake of Jerusalem, the full tearing would be delayed, but it would not be canceled. That single detail changes everything, because it means Israel entered a strange and terrifying condition. Outwardly united, inwardly judged, politically stable, spiritually sentenced, still singing the songs of covenant while already standing under a decree of division. It was a kingdom living on borrowed time. And that may be one of the most psychologically unsettling realities in all of biblical history. What do you call a nation that has not yet fallen, but has already been measured? What do you call a life that still looks intact, while something decisive has already shifted beneath the surface? This is why the story feels so close even now, because collapse does not always begin with visible ruin. Sometimes it begins in the hidden moment when a line is crossed, a center is abandoned, and the consequences remain invisible for a season. The walls are still standing, the routines continue, the festivals are observed, but the sentence has already moved. That is what makes this part prophetic in the deepest sense. Prophecy is not merely prediction, it is revelation. It exposes what human eyes cannot yet see, and what Ahijah revealed was terrifying. Solomon's kingdom was not heading toward danger, it was already under it. So if this moment unsettles you, let it. Ask yourself where things may still appear whole while something deeper has already been lost. Not as fear, but as recognition. Because awareness is where mercy often begins, and blindness is where judgment quietly matures. The man chosen to receive 10 pieces was not Solomon's son, not the royal heir, but Jeroboam, a rising servant, a future rival, already standing in the shadow of a throne that did not yet know it was dying. In the next part, the funeral will end, the son will take power, and in a matter of days, prophecy will become political catastrophe. The day after Solomon, the empire looked intact. The throne was still in place. The court still stood. The treasury had not vanished overnight. Jerusalem still gleamed with the memory of power. From a distance, it may have seemed as though nothing had changed except the name of the king. But that was the illusion. Because Rehoboam did not inherit a stable kingdom, he inherited a delayed crisis. He stepped onto a throne already sitting over a fault line, and almost immediately the ground began to move. The people came to him with one request, not a revolution, not a threat, not a conspiracy, a plea. Your father made our yoke heavy. Lighten the hard service, ease the burden, speak with mercy, and we will serve you. That is what makes this moment so psychologically devastating. Rehoboam was given the rarest gift any ruler can receive at the beginning of power, a simple path to peace. He did not need military genius. He did not need prophetic fire. He did not need to win a war. He had one task: lower the burden, and the kingdom might hold. Instead, he tightened it. He asked the elders first, the old men who had stood before Solomon, men who understood power not as display, but as weight. Their answer was almost shockingly restrained. Be kind to these people. Serve them today and they will serve you forever. It was wise counsel, political wisdom, human wisdom, even covenant wisdom. But Rehoboam turned from it. And that turn is one of the most fateful pivots in the entire biblical narrative. Because then he went to the young men he had grown up with, the voices nearest to his pride, the generation that had inherited luxury, but not the cost of building it. They told him what insecure power always wants to hear: do not bend, dominate. Do not soften, intensify. Do not win loyalty, demand submission. And Rehoboam listened. Then came the line that detonated the kingdom. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. It is one of the coldest statements ever spoken by a king at the start of his reign. Not diplomacy, not discernment, a threat dressed as authority. In one sentence, he revealed not strength but fear, not kingship but immaturity. He mistook harshness for power, and in doing so, he struck the fracture line with his own hands. Then the explosion came, not over years, not through a slow bureaucratic unraveling. In days, the kingdom broke. 10 tribes walked away. No drawn-out negotiation, no second assembly, no gradual loss of confidence. They simply withdrew. What portion do we have in David? To your tents, O Israel. That cry was more than political. It was emotional, historical, almost liturgical in its force. It was the sound of a people no longer willing to carry what had been placed on their backs. It was not merely rebellion against Rehoboam. It was release from a pressure that had been building long before he spoke. Because if a nation can fracture that fast, then the pressure was already there. People do not abandon a dynasty in a single moment, unless something inside the system has been grinding them down for years. Which means Solomon's celebrated golden age may have contained a hidden underside: forced labor, regional resentment, taxation, administrative centralization, the concentration of splendor in Jerusalem while the outer tribes carried the load. That does not erase Solomon's greatness, but it complicates it. The temple was glorious. The court was magnificent. International prestige reached its peak. But perhaps some of that brilliance was resting on an exhausted people. Perhaps what looked like national triumph from above felt very different below. And when Rehoboam chose arrogance instead of mercy, he did not create the crisis from nothing. He exposed it. That is why this part is more than political history. It is a theological X-ray of leadership. Scripture does not simply show us that kings fail. It shows us how power reveals what is already hidden in the heart and in the nation. Rehoboam became the instrument through which buried tensions rose into daylight. His foolishness was real, but it landed on soil already prepared by Solomon's compromises, policies, and spiritual drift. Then the violence sharpened. Adoram, the official over forced labor, was sent out, and the people stoned him to death. Rehoboam fled to Jerusalem. What had begun as negotiation ended in blood panic and the near collapse of the royal house. The united monarchy, forged under Saul, expanded under David, glorified under Solomon, was now shattered under Solomon's son. So was Rehoboam merely foolish, or was he the terrible moment when everything hidden finally became visible? Because once a kingdom divides politically, something darker often follows. Power vacuums do not stay empty. Spiritual fractures do not remain symbolic. In the next part, we move beyond the throne and into the unseen realm, because after the crown split, the deeper war was only beginning. The Bible never treats idols as harmless objects. It treats them as thresholds. Wood, stone, gold, yes, but never only that. In the biblical worldview, idolatry is not merely bad art or misguided symbolism. It is allegiance. It is permission. It is the moment a people transfers trust, fear, love, and dependence away from the living God and towards something shaped by appetite, power, fertility, war, control. That is why this part of Solomon's legacy is darker than politics, darker than succession, darker even than division. He did not merely allow idols to exist at the edges of the kingdom. He gave them room. He built around them. He normalized them. This is the detail that should unsettle us. Solomon, the temple builder, did not just privately drift. He institutionalized spiritual compromise. He gave foreign worship a place in the land that had been ordered around covenant. He turned what should have remained a temptation into infrastructure. What begins as personal compromise becomes public architecture, and what becomes public architecture eventually outlives the man who built it. So when Solomon died, the system did not die with him. It remained. And now nothing was holding it back. That is where Jeroboam enters the story with terrifying clarity. He had received the prophecy. He had inherited the northern tribes. But he also understood something psychologically brutal about power. If the people kept returning to Jerusalem to worship, their hearts might return there too. Their bodies would follow the pilgrimage, and eventually their loyalty might follow the altar. So he acted, not with swords first, but with symbols. 2 golden calves, one in Bethel, one in Dan, a replacement map of worship, a re-engineered sacred geography. No need to go to Jerusalem. No need to journey to the place God had chosen. Worship could now be local, immediate, politically useful, and safely under royal control. Then came a new priesthood, not from the sons of Levi, but from among the people at large. Then new feast patterns redesigned to mirror what God had ordained while quietly severing it from God's command. This is what makes false religion so dangerous in Scripture. It rarely arrives wearing the face of obvious evil. It comes dressed as convenience, efficiency, accessibility, national identity. It tells people they can keep the language of worship while changing its center. It offers spiritual feeling without covenant cost, and people accept it because it feels easier. That is the real shock. The Northern Kingdom did not abandon religion, it redesigned it. It kept sacrifice festivals, priests, holy places, and sacred language. But it removed the one thing that made worship true obedience to the God who had spoken. This was not a rejection of spirituality, it was a domestication of it. And that is a deeper catastrophe than many realize, because this was not just political division, it was spiritual decentralization. Jerusalem removed, truth fragmented, worship redesigned, the center no longer held. What Solomon had opened through compromise, Jeroboam now stabilized through policy. One man blurred the boundary, the next built a system inside the breach. And once false worship becomes institutional, it no longer needs persuasion every day. It begins to reproduce itself through habit, memory, family festivals, and fear. If you have ever watched truth be replaced by something more convenient, more manageable, more flattering to human power, then you already understand this moment. Remember it. Name it. Because truth often survives first as memory before it returns as reform. And now the damage was no longer hidden in altars or arguments. It would move into history with full force, into invasion, loss, exile, and fire. We trace the 5 terrible consequences that erupted from this fracture, and why Solomon's death was not the end of the crisis, but the moment it began to spread. This is where the story stops being gradual and becomes immediate, not in theory, not in symbolism, but in consequences that moved through Israel like a chain reaction the moment Solomon was gone. 5 things happened fast, precise, irreversible. The first was unity. It did not weaken. It died. The kingdom that had stood under David and expanded under Solomon did not slowly erode. It fractured in a matter of days. 10 tribes to the north, 2 to the south. No shared throne, no shared future. The covenant people of one God now lived under two crowns, two strategies, two fears. And once unity breaks at that level, it does not easily return. The second was protection. It did not collapse loudly, it lifted quietly. Scripture begins to name adversaries not as new threats, but as rising forces already prepared. Edom stirring again in the south, Aram strengthening in the north, Egypt watching, calculating. These were not random enemies appearing out of nowhere. They were pressures that had been held back, contained under a season of divine restraint, and now that restraint was gone. Because protection in the biblical world is not only military, it is relational. When covenant is fractured, covering shifts, and nations feel it before they can explain it. The third was truth. It did not disappear, it fragmented. Two kingdoms meant two centers of authority. Jerusalem in the south, Bethel, and Dan in the north. Two priesthoods. Two narratives about what worship should look like. The same God still named, but approached through different systems, different compromises, different interpretations. And once truth is divided geographically, it rarely stays intact theologically. People begin to inherit not just land, but altered versions of reality. The fourth was leadership. It did not vanish. It destabilized. In Judah, a fragile line of Davidic kings struggled to hold continuity. In Israel, the northern kingdom thrones turned into revolving doors. Dynasties rose and fell through conspiracy, violence, assassination. Kings did not build, they replaced. Authority no longer rested on covenant identity, but on survival. And when leadership becomes temporary, vision becomes short-term. And when vision becomes short-term, nations begin to decay from within. Then came the fifth consequence, the most dangerous of all. Brokenness became normal. At first, the division was shocking. The shift in worship was noticeable. The instability of leadership felt dangerous. But over time, something far more subtle happened. People adapted. Children were born into a divided kingdom and never knew it as unity. Worship in altered forms became tradition. Political instability became expectation. What once would have been called crisis slowly became culture. And that is the deepest collapse a civilization can experience. Not when it breaks, but when it forgets it was ever whole. This is the moment history rarely marks with a date. The moment when people stop asking what went wrong and begin living as if nothing did. From there, the future was no longer unpredictable. It was inevitable. 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel falls to Assyria, its people scattered, its identity shattered. 587 BC, Jerusalem burns under Babylon, the temple reduced to ash, the symbol of God's dwelling consumed in fire. But those are not the true beginnings of the fall. They are the visible endings. The real collapse happened here, in the quiet drift of Solomon, in the spoken prophecy of division, in the arrogance of a son, in the redesign of worship, in the normalization of what should have never been accepted. History does not collapse at the moment of destruction. It collapses at the moment no one recognizes. And that is why this story does not stay in the past, because the pattern remains. Unity can fracture faster than we think. Protection can lift without announcement. Truth can divide without disappearing. Leadership can exist without stability. And brokenness can become normal without resistance. So the question is no longer about Solomon. It is about recognition. What in your world still looks strong, but has already begun to split underneath? Because the most dangerous moment is not when everything falls apart. It is when everything still looks like it's holding together, and no one realizes it already isn't. And perhaps that is the quiet wisdom this story leaves behind. Collapse rarely begins with catastrophe, it begins with drift. And restoration does not begin with power, it begins with awareness. For those who have lived long enough to see seasons rise and fall, you know this: what we tolerate in silence, we eventually inherit in consequence. Solomon's legacy was not only what he built, but what he allowed. But there is still hope, because what is recognized can be restored. What is remembered can be realigned, and what is surrendered can be healed. So guard what remains, strengthen what still stands, and finish your story with the faithfulness Solomon could not. Solomon's story was never just about a king, it was about a pattern blessing drift delay and then collapse. He built the temple, yes, but he also built the conditions that would one day see it burn. And that is the tension we are left with, not just what a man achieves, but what his choices set in motion long after he is gone. So pause for a moment and ask yourself what in your life still looks strong, but is already shifting underneath. If this story stayed with you, don't let it end here. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below, because some truths are meant to be carried together. And stay with us, because the next chapter reveals how one decision reshaped generations, because sometimes the most dangerous collapse is the one no one sees coming.